Hey guys, all right. In this lecture series, we're going to be covering paleohistology, which is actually the subfield of paleontology and research that I do here. And so this is something that I'm really, really interested in. However, I'm going to try to summarize it for you guys in more of a layman's way because I could definitely go into the weeds and a lot of this stuff. The first thing we're going to do is that we're going to introduce it by indicating of why do we do this in the first place and what is it, right? So we can interpret lots of material from various different other life history studies throughout the world and modern animals. And so what that allows us to do is be able to get, for instance, how old an individual elephant is, like in the image here on the top left, or perhaps how um, what's their population structure? Are there more younger ones and there are older ones in that population structure? What is their growth rate? So how quickly did they grow? Did they have growth spurts? Did they constantly keep growing throughout their life? Did they stop growing at some point? Like we do as humans, we stop around age 20, give or take, depending on males or females. But prior to that, we do quite a bit of growing, but we start to plateau a little bit as we get into our teenage years, right? So all of that we can do in modern organisms. But then how do we figure that out for extinct animals? And that is through the study of paleohistology. So paleohistology is the study of ancient paleo tissues, histo. And so this is my favorite subfield because it allows me to kind of look into and tap into the animal in this kind of forensic, extinct forensic kind of way. Because otherwise, if I didn't do so with some of these different methods, I wouldn't be able to get this information otherwise. So, what are tissues? Let's remind ourselves that, right? So, to start off, we've got atoms. They're the least trustworthy of all because they make everything up. Then they combine into molecules, which will form other macromolecules like DNA. Those will then eventually combine to form different organelles, like smaller versions of like mini organs. And I put that in quotes because they're not technically organs. Those will then compose different types of organelles, will make up a cell. And then finally, those cells will stitch together and lock up to form a tissue, which is like a fabric. Those tissues then make organs, and eventually we have the organism itself. And so some of the first studies on this were done by this dapper fella here, Gideon Mantell. And so this was around the kind of mid 1800s, who described the first histological section of vertebrates. But then this field of study kind of lay dormant for almost an entire century, up until this individual here, Donald Enlow, and his colleague Sidney Brown started publishing on more histological studies of fossil and recent bone as well too, so modern animals, to the extent that a lot of their research is still being used today as primary sources because the bone necessarily hasn't changed. They've described it in such a really good systematic way that even individuals in forensic medicine and anthropology are still using their studies as well too. So one of the things though that this started to lay down is that it's stressed to us as academics and paleontologists that we can get a lot of more information from the inside of the bone than what about certain things like age perhaps and the growth rate of the animal then we can even perhaps begin to postulate or guess about what we can do about that from the outside of the bone. So to get to this, though, I'll present a couple of neat findings for you in the second half of this lecture. Let's go through what this process is and what does it actually involve to be able to actually get inside the actual dinosaur bones and tap into that knowledge. So one thing is that this process, at its nature, is a bit destructive. So some people call it destructive analysis, but let me give you an example here of why I don't like using that term. So for instance, let's say you're making yourself your dinner. You got your mac and cheese noodles on the stove. They're boiling in terms of that water for 7 minutes. And then once that's done, you add your cheese, your butter, or the toppings and seasonings that you want to. You put that stuff into a bowl, and then you grab your fork, and on your way over to watch TV at either the dinner table or on your couch, you just unceremoniously open up the trash can, and along with your bowl and your fork, you just dump that stuff in the garbage, and then you go off and watch TV. Is that what you do? No, right? What do? You eat the food. So you've cooked it, and then you're going to eat it. And by eating that food, you're transforming it into energy that your body can now use to power your body. So that's what we're doing here, right? We're not necessarily getting energy, but we're getting more knowledge from something that we normally would have not been able to get in the first place. So this is why I prefer to call it consumptive analysis, because just like we're consuming food to then transform it into energy, we're now consuming a portion of this specimen, so that way we can get information based on the animal that we wouldn't be able to obtain otherwise. Just like you really don't want to be eating a raw egg, which would be inedible, right? So the first step of this is to preserve the original bone shape and its features. And the way that I go about this and do this is a variety of different ways. What we can do is do traditional casting and molding. And so, therefore, what you're seeing here around a larger bone, a humerus of a duck-billed dinosaur, is a nice big mold. And then the opposite side would have been on here as well, too. It's been removed for the picture, so you can see kind of how it sits in. And so therefore, we've got a nice rigid silicon mold. And so that would allow us to be able to then pour like a resin plastic material in there that would set and cure, and we would be able to have a nice, beautiful bone. That's the exact same thing that people do when you're trying to mold your plastic toys that you see at Target or Walmart or wherever it is that you're going to be able to get. On the bottom here is the same idea, but these were for smaller ones, so therefore we encapsulated the entire bone. These ones were about maybe as big as maybe one of your fingers, whereas this one here was about as big as my arm. So obviously a bit of a different way to do that. The other way to 3D or to preserve the original shape is to 3D model things. So these are 3D models of skeletons and bones and other things that I've kind of done. This is an impression of a skeleton, and I know it kind of looks like a little bit of a dog's breakfast, but I assure you it looks pretty good compared to what some other fossils do. And it's broken up because it's had to live off for about 70 million years worth of time in terms of just encapsulating this rock. So what we are able to see in this is here's a rib cage, here's a scapula, here's a various different vertebrae, here's parts of the hip area. Of course, if you kind of had this in front of you, you'd be able to see a little bit more of it. Portions of the tail extending outwards, and then the hind limb making its way down here with the femur, the tibia, and of some impressions of some other portions of the skeleton as well too. This actually had a counterpart to it, so meaning the other side. So it kind of had nice impressions. So what I did with this is I just took a bunch of pictures with like a nice DSLR camera. You can do this with like iPhones these days and other different things. And I threw it into a software that was able to then 3D model this for me. Now, it sounds like a pretty easy thing to do, and sometimes it is. But there are some nooks and crannies of things that we want to do to try to get it as accurate as we possibly can, as what you're seeing here. So every single dimension is correct. So this is one of a larger slab, probably something about as big as like a, oh, let's just say like something like of the entire desk that you're kind of sitting on. Whereas, and you can kind of see a scale bar here. Whereas this bone here was probably about half my height. Okay. So this gives you some perspective. The other benefit of this is that now that I've 3D modeled these, I can actually share them with individuals internationally in case they can't make it to, perhaps to a museum collection. So I could actually send them a 3D model that's scaled down to the correct dimensions and say, hey, here you go. This isn't the perfect thing, but this was actually really quite useful. And I utilize this to collaborate with various different other researchers, particularly during the 2020 lockdowns and COVID and all that other stuff that we kind of lived through. So how then do we go about once we've 3D modeled this? Well, we'll use a variety of different slow cutting saws that will cut only about 0.5 millimeter thin to reduce as much of the kerf loss as possible. So because we're, again, even though it's sort of consumptive in nature, we're trying to use up as least amount of the specimen as possible so it doesn't end up getting kind of destroyed over time. So we use a variety of different saws. What I primarily use is the Buehler Isomet. It's kind of a geological instrument, so to be able to make petrographic sections of rocks and minerals. But because the bone is pretty much just as hard, so we utilize in that way. These are lap wheel grinders, very similar to what you'd see in actually a clay making studio, but we'll put magnetic grip pads on here with some water. There's a couple other tools here as well too, with some other saws that helps us kind of grind things down. So there's a variety of different kind of tools that we would go through this. And I sometimes do workshops with my students to teach people how to do this process. But the idealness is that Once we've kind of sectioned a portion of this specimen off, we'll actually glue that then to a plexiglass slide. Some people use normal glass. There's a variety of different reasons why I use plexiglass only. Um, and then we'll polish that down to a nice thickness. The ideal thickness depends on the specimen, but the average usually ends up being somewhere around 100 microns. Goodness, what's 100 microns, right? Not something that you oftentimes hear on a daily basis. That's about the thickness of a human hair, right? So pretty thin. But occasionally we have larger bones, right? So what I showed you a moment ago was more for smaller things that we can handle in our hand or so. But if we have those really big bones that we're trying to section, well, then we have to do a little bit of a difference. So first we are going to have to find a way to secure the patient. So in this case here, I was using a geological diamond plated wire saw. So here is a wire. And yes, that is a skateboard wheel. We'll see a zoomed in image of that here in just a minute. And there's this track where the specimen just sits on it, and the wire actually, along with this arm and the track that we're seeing out of the picture, is actually going to be feeding itself through the specimen. So what we did is we built this jig here to then strap in the specimen here. So this large bone that's about as long as my leg. So therefore, then this bone would not move at all while it's being cut and after it's cut. So that's why I see all these sandbags and foam and everything and nicely strapped in. Because if it does move while it's being cut, then it might do like a weird angle then afterwards. Like if you've been cutting something and all of a sudden like you realize, oh, you're on the wrong angle and you're never going to meet up. Or it could actually snap that wire. And those wires aren't cheap. I'm talking several hundreds and sometimes thousands of dollars. So we do our best to try to make sure to reduce that sort of a cost. I've never had a wire snap yet, other than for one that was actually a really old one that was on its way out. So that in over the next slide or so, I'm going to show you some videos here that's going to have some sound. It's going to have a little bit of a squealing sound to it to give you an idea of how this actually, the process goes about. So I'm going to start playing here in the background. So this is actually the wire spinning on this wheel. So this track wheel is keeping it in the position. And it's slowly but surely cutting away at that area there. So if we were to zoom in on that exact same kind of image, then you can see that we've got all this material just slowly and surely flaking off. You can sometimes make this a wet cutting, but we did it just by dry. And it just slowly making its way across. So you can imagine this took a while to get through this entire bone. How long? Yeah, we kind of left it on overnight. And then I came back and it was cut by the morning, right? So let's just say 24 hours, right? So, and obviously through the thicker parts, it's going to take a little longer than it does through the thinner parts. One of the things that sometimes students ask me is, have I ever tried this dino dust here? And yes, I absolutely have. How could I not, right? But would I recommend eating it to anybody else? Well, I'm going to ask you this question. Would you eat chalk? Probably not. Okay. All right. So once we've cut through that, this is a single kind of section right here. And then I ended up kind of cutting out like a hockey puck, because what I'll do is I'll actually embed that into a resin. Sort of like if you'd see like those like tchotchke souvenir things that you see at souvenir shops of like things embedded into like a little resin blocks, like a little tiny toy or some kind of a silhouette of like a skyline or something like that. So you'll see those in blocks, like these plastic blocks embedded into that. That's exactly what I'll do next, right? I'll clean all this stuff off and I'll embed that, because this part here in the middle is going to be quite fragile and frail. So if I were to just glue that onto something, it's just going to break right off. So I want to make sure that it's got a lot of structural integrity so it doesn't flake off and break off as I try to cut it and manipulate it. So then once I've glued it onto a slide, I'll use all the other tools, all the other saws that we kind of saw before to cut it off of that slide. And once I've cut it onto just a single slide like this, I will then take a glass block, take liquid grit, similar to something like very, very finely ground pencil lead, and put that onto a glass block and just slowly but surely, Mr. Miyagi, wax on, wax off. And so what I'm doing there is trying to reduce the amount of thickness by very small increments and by putting pressure. So you can see my hands are putting pressure perhaps on this corner and not on this area, because I might be pretty happy with how thick this is. And how thick or how thin something needs to be, that is where the art form of this comes in. So this is where I've kind of perfected this process for myself, and others will reach out to me to be able to do this for them, particularly in larger sections for things that like you're seeing here of a section that's almost the size of my hand. And so this is a pretty painstaking process. It's not something that someone couldn't learn, but it's definitely something that has taken me a few years to develop over time. So once we have that all polished down to the thickness that we need, we'll throw it under a microscope and we will start imaging things. So we'll look at what we look for in the second half of this lecture. But you can see a general idea here of a microscope. And so some slides are going to be bigger than others. And generally a quick zoomed in image of more or less what that would have looked like. We're looking right through the microscope. So what we'll then do is repeat this process multiple times in various different ways, shapes, and forms. So this gives you a perspective of just a handful of the slides I've made over the years in terms of some research. So to give you perspective, this is an average size pen. So these are all quite large. Some individuals choose to do really small slides. It just depends on what specimen it is that you're trying to section, right? So some of them turn out to be really nice. I'm going to zoom in on one here in a minute. This is probably one of the these two are the largest two slides I've ever made so far as like a single section. If I were to make this one again, one of the things I didn't particularly like about it, you can actually see it from here, is that in this area here, there's a bit of lighter regions and there are darker regions. And because it was so large, it was actually quite difficult for me on those glass blocks I was showing you on the previous slide to be able to grind that down to a nice even surface like I have with the majority of these other ones. So some of them turn out really nice, like this one up here up at the top. It's one of my favorite ones. It's just really nice and even surface all the way across. Of course, this side is a little darker, but that's actually some natural staining in the bone. But it's really nice and even all the way across, unlike these ones. So these ones here, the one on the left is the very first slide, histological slide I ever made. Not a great one. You can see that like when I cut it, it was even like a kind of a crooked way. It's actually a pretty good slide in terms of the thickness and everything and all the techniques that were involved. So I did a good job with that. I'll give myself a pat on the back. However, towards the very end of this process and some of those saws and things like those grinding lap wheels that I was showing you, well, one of those grinding lap wheels won the battle. So this slide got stuck on it due to just the adhesion forces of water and the friction that was happening. So it got stuck onto it and it slid towards the side of the wheel and it just completely grinded into the slide right here. That's what you're seeing. So it completely flung out from my hand. And that's one of the reasons why I use plexiglass rather than glass slides, because if that had flung out of my hand like that, it would just shattered. So I would have still been able to use this as some research, but this part, not so good anymore. So I redid that slide. And then my second slide, as you're seeing here on the right, based on just the numbers that are being added up here, 584 to 585 is the exact hoping, or what I was hoping for in the first place. So sometimes things like this happen. Has it happened to me ever since? Yeah, it has. But it is kind of just what it is. It just does. It just happens if something kind of slips out. The unfortunate part is that it'll happen almost at the very tail end of the process, right before you're able to start looking at it under a microscope. So that means that you have to go through the entire process. Sometimes it's painstakingly like about a week's worth of hurry up for an hour's worth of work and then wait 24 hours for something to cure or dry until you can get back to this stage again. All right, so I'm going to end this first half of the lecture here so that way you can take a break. And the next one, we're going to actually talk about various different things that we can figure out from paleohistology.